welcome to the conference. I helped to write the exhibit that's out front, so if you get time during your break, go ahead and take a look at the exhibit. I will explain a little bit how it's organized as we go on here. So I thought today I was asked to do an overview of the conference and of the exhibit on the life of Joaquin Miller, and to kind of familiarize those of you who don't know anything about Joaquin Miller with a little bit of the facts of his life and the body of work that he has left to us as time has gone on. Most of you have heard of Miller, know something about him, like myself. I didn't know much. I just knew that he was called the Poet of the Sierras, and here's a book published during his lifetime in the 1890s called The Complete Poetical Works, and he was called the Poet of the Sierras. But as I started getting more involved with his life and looking into what he had left us, it turned out that he really wasn't the Poet of the Sierras. He was really the poet of Mount Shasta. Almost everything that he wrote in his lifetime, he ascribed back to his time here in the 1850s when he was a young man as a gold miner, and up behind Wairika and down in Shasta City and here at Lower Soda Springs and over in McLeod where he lived with his Indian wife. He was really associated for 4 years in these varied enterprises and in battles and massacres. And it just totally formed him. And so he said later in his life that everything he is today he owes to his time here at Mount Shasta. So that's really what the exhibit tries to get to, is all the reasons why Miller and Mount Shasta are so intimately connected. So even all of these poems, and they're, you know, he was a great womanizer, a great lover of women and of beauty, and he traveled all over the world, but he always comes back to his experiences. Somehow in his poetry, there's that core of what he learned here in Mount Shasta. So that's what I'm going to talk about. Like I say, it'll be a bit rambling because there's no way the man wrote from 1870 when 1868, his first book of poems, then his prose novels he started writing in the 1870s, all the way up to 1913 when he passed away. He was writing every day and publishing, so there's 30 books, 400 articles. He really published something almost every month of his life. He's constantly writing. And that's something that gets lost when you hear about his time here at Mount Shasta. You don't realize he had this big body of work, and there's no way you can really grasp it easily. The thing that I found interesting about him being called the Poet of the Sierras, he wrote a book in 1880s, 81 I think, called Memory and Rhyme, 1884 if I'm not mistaken. And in there he talks about naming the book that made him famous in London in 1870, was called Songs of the Sierras. But he said it was really he and his drinking buddies, who were all Irish, in London at that time, they sat around and he gave them 6 titles, and they had to vote on which title the book would be the best. And it became Songs of the Sierras. Everybody liked that. So from that book he became known as the Poet of the Sierras, because Songs of the Sierras, Poet of the Sierras. But really he was Mount Shasta's poet. I someday would like to establish him a little bit more along those lines. This is a wonderful photograph. You're probably familiar, if nothing else, have heard that great quote of the beginning of Unwritten History. Lone is God, white as the winter moon, Mount Shasta rises up sudden and solitary from the great black forests of Northern California. It's taken me 10 to 15 years to memorize that, by the way. But there's a great black forest. This is a photograph by a friend and former ranger here at the Mount Shasta Ranger District, Mike Hupp. He's a great photographer. It's a little blurry, but it kind of captured that lone is God and white as a winter moon. And this is done pretty much from the site of Joaquin Miller's second cabin in this area at Squaw Creek over in McLeod. And this was an eclipse night in 2011, and that's why you could actually expose both the moon, which is normally much stronger than the light on the mountain, expose them both together in one exposure. So I thought, and we use this as our main photograph in the exhibit here, because it captures that experience. It's from where Joaquin Miller would have been living for a year, seeing the mountain as a single peak, which, you know, you have to remember that all the imagery that we've been fed about Mount Shasta is always from this area here. You get the double peaks, but from the north, from the east, from the west, south, southeast, it's different. And this is what the mountain looks like from the cloud. And at the base of Castle Crags, back in the 1850s, Miller had a cabin with Mountain Joe, and Miller built this cabin in Washington, D.C. You might not be familiar that there's a Joaquin Miller cabin in Rock Creek Park, which is like the Central Park for New York. This is Rock Creek Park for Washington, D.C. And Miller went there in 1885 and built this cabin as a replica of the cabin he had with Mountain Joe down here at Lower Soda Springs. And it still exists. This is a photograph I took, and it's still there. You can kind of get to see the style. It's a little more elaborate. It's kind of fun to see. And cabins, you know, hopefully Richard Silver will show the discovery they made, Julie Cassidy made this past year about another cabin of Joaquin Miller's. Cabins in Miller are very much associated. I talked about this in the tour yesterday, that a chapter called The Lost Cabin, which is in the Unwritten History, Life Amongst the Modocs book, kind of established Miller and cabins in the public mind. And all his life he did live in cabins, he built cabins, he built them with his own hands. So Mount Shasta, this is kind of the area, you know, we're down here somewhere. This would be McLeod over here, and the other side, is that pretty? Yeah, there's Avalanche also over here, McLeod. Diller Canyon, this is Shastina in the main peak of Shasta. Modoc lava beds would be up here. And this is the range where Miller lived for the most part around Mount Shasta. From 1854 to about 1860, on and off, he came back and forth. So, and you know, forgive me if a lot of you know all this story. I need to go over some of these things for some of you who don't know anything about Joaquin Miller. Here's the quote: "Alone is God, white as a winter moon." And this will establish forever Miller and Mount Shasta. Such a poetic, beautiful quote. The beauty of Mount Shasta just shines through. And you know, my experience with Miller, I'm an art historian, and I found an illustration of Mount Shasta in a book by Joaquin Miller, and I bought the book and didn't get into the book for a year or so, and a year and a half later I started reading some of it. And it dawned on me, this isn't about the beauty of Mount Shasta, this book, Unwritten History. And even the title, Unwritten History, just kind of went through my brain, not the other side, as a lot of things do. But after a while, you begin to realize that another quote in the same chapter, he says, "Mount Shasta was before me. For the first time, I now looked upon the mountain in whose shadows so many tragedies were to be enacted." And you go, tragedies? What's he talking about? This is a beautiful mountain. What's the tragedies? And what it turns out to be is that he came to this area in the 1850s, and he lived with an Indian girl and her father over in McLeod, and he lived with the Indians, and he began to see that the treatment of the native peoples was one of total cruelty and repression. And he decided to do something about it after he left this area and started writing. And so the first book that really addresses these issues of genocide, actually, and extermination, those aren't my words, those are words that were used in the era, were something that he rallied against and railed against. Oops, so I must have pressed that twice. Let me make sure of time too, because we're all going to compress this. I have about 300 slides, and so we'll probably get to about 50 of them. I now stood face to face. This is from the book Unwritten History, Life Amongst the Modocs. I now stood face to face with the outpost of the great events of my life. Here were the Tawny people, the Indian people, with whom I was to mingle. There loomed Mount Shasta, with which my name, if remembered at all, will be remembered. So that's the phrase that we've organized about. There loomed Mount Shasta, with which my name, if remembered at all, will be remembered. If you think about it, I mean, how many of us can say, this is in 1870, he lived another 40 years. How many of us can say, well, I'm going to always be remembered for this, looking forward? You know, he kind of knew, somehow he had a picture of himself, and he understood the importance of the messages that he had. And, you know, for today, I wanted to communicate that it's, you know, the more and more we do this, the more and more we learn that Miller really did have something to offer for posterity. It's not just the local geography, which he does in many ways illustrate beautifully, and talks about the different, you know, the land and the earth and how it affected him, the different places, the McLeod and Humbug Creek and Wairika, and all those places are immortalized and add depth to our experience of the landscape. When we walk around, we can go to Castle Crags, where the Battle of Castle Crags took place, and we get a feeling of the history by knowing the stories. That's all great, but he had a bigger message. There's kind of two sides to this. There's kind of the local geographic history, which is wonderful and very full from his experience, especially from his diary. But there's also the bigger messages. And I think, I'm going to try to just use two quotes. Here's Miller in front. Horses have a big thing to do. I thought about this yesterday for the first time. Horses, because I'll show you in a second. His life revolving around Mount Shasta. These are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different eras in his life. And a wonderful picture of Mount Shasta that is in the exhibit here by Stewart. James Everett Stewart is an early California artist who was an acquaintance of Miller and did Miller's portrait that now is one of the treasures in the California State Library. And I'll show you that picture later if we have time. I mentioned there loomed Mount Shasta, with which my name, if remembered at all, will be remembered. So the first reason is this unwritten history. It has that quote, "Alone is God," and it's all about Mount Shasta. It became a big seller in Europe, especially in England in 1873. And it brought Mount Shasta to the world. This was really the one person who popularized the existence of Mount Shasta and made it known where it was. And for most of the late 1800s, it was Miller's book that kind of popularized Mount Shasta. So we kind of owe a debt of gratitude in terms of tourism and knowledge of Mount Shasta to the world. It was Miller who did that. The second reason he's linked to Mount Shasta is the Battle of Castle Crags, which he talked about in his 1873 book, and he wrote a pamphlet in 1893. He was always asked about it, and he lived up, he built it up into a myth, and it's now part of the California state legacy, is the Battle of Castle Crags. You'll find plaques about it. But it's really because of Miller's talking about it. Otherwise, it would have been another event that just kind of went to the wayside. Then you have Living with the Wintu, because Miller had an Indian wife, a young girl, over in McLeod, and he had a child by that woman, and then he left her, abandoned her. Well, there is no better thing for establishing reputation than abandoning your wife and child. It will forever be a scandal and forever associate you with that place where it happened. And so his whole life of living with the Wintu and feeling for these people and then leaving his wife and child behind kind of is part of our local myth. And it's a local myth. It's a Mount Shasta myth. And therefore, it's another reason why Joaquin Miller is known as being part of Mount Shasta. Then the diary. He did leave a diary, and it's in the University Library down at Claremont College's Hanault Library. And I got to see this out of the original papers at one time. I went down there. And it's just all kinds of sheets of paper from different time periods. And for about 4 years, he kept a journal and wrote all these little details. I'll show you a few. Fifth reason he's associated with Mount Shasta were the massacres, especially the Pitt River Massacre, where Pitt River Indians massacred white settlers, and I'll talk about that a little later. And then the white settlers, in retaliation, came and massacred the Pitt River Indians. And Miller was part of that second enterprise because he was living with this native girl. The white settlers thought, oh, Miller's probably leading these Indians against us, and so they forced him to lead an expedition and help them kill the perpetrators of the first massacre. It's a very convoluted scene. Miller regretted his whole life having led the white settlers to kill his friends. And it forms the kind of the core of his psyche throughout all of the following literature. Beauty and conservation, he was pretty much California's first environmentalist, led the first California Arbor Day, planted trees throughout the Bay Area, talked even in the 1870s about preserving the environment here in Mount Shasta and the horrible effects of mining on the streams and killing the salmon. He was the first person really to say all of that, and he deserves some credit for that. But I'm not going to dwell on that today. It's more just his life here that's going to be more interesting. So I'll make sure we have time. We've got about 15 minutes. Here's Miller in 1863. Now, a lot of people hear about Joaquin Miller as this cowboy kind of character. That is, in a sense, he was a miner and he was a character, but he never was really a cowboy character. So that's kind of one of those myths that needs to be addressed. You can tell this is a very intense-looking man. 1863, he had been here in Mount Shasta, then he went to the Idaho mines and became a Pony Express typewriter. He was partners with a man for a year, made a fortune running gold back and forth on horseback. had enough money after that to go to Eugene, buy a house for his father, and buy a newspaper. So this is him as editor of the newspaper which he bought. And he really was an intense person, very intense. So here's the first of the two messages that I think are universal that Miller was trying to get across. The first one, when he's young, this is like his body of work when he's younger, his poems and his writings. He says, we are making dreadful history. He's writing this in the front of a book called Shadows of Shasta. And it's never really been reprinted, but it's about Castle Crags. And in the introduction here, this is from the introduction to that book called Shadows of Shasta. He says he saw 2 Indian children in chains being taken to Reading to be taken to reservation someplace. And it got him really upset. And so here he's saying, you know, we are making dreadful history dreadfully fast. How terrible it will all read when the writer and reader of these lines are long since forgotten. Ages may roll by. We may build a city over every dead tribe's bones. We may bury the last Indian deep as the eternal gulf. But these records will remain and will rise up in testimony against us to the last day of our race. Now, previously he had written unwritten history trying to kind of get the same message across. But this is the most powerful statement I've seen of Miller's kind of early years. He's trying to say, you know, we have done this horror to these people. We have exterminated these people. And we may try to bury it and we may try to ignore it, but it's here and I'm writing it down so you know that it happened. And periodically his voice comes back to not haunt us, but to tell us, you know, there's things that you just do have to acknowledge, at least acknowledge. So that's, to me, that's important. That's not just local here. That's on a worldwide scale, and all around the world, the same history is repeated year after year or decade after decade. And I think Miller is particularly poignant in his language. So that's the first message. As he got older, and here, this is a very famed photographer named Morehouse up in the Portland area. Took this picture, and it says up there, Joaquin Miller, poet laureate of Oregon. He was known, in Oregon, he's known as the poet of Oregon because he lived and worked and wrote so many poems as he was a judge in Central Oregon for many years. So as he gets older, this is as old as it gets. These are his ashes being sprinkled at his funeral pyre, which he built himself down in Oakland. He founded this spiritual community, utopian community called the Heights above Oakland. He lived there and was kind of the center, as people are rediscovering now, as the center of bohemian activity in the Bay Area from about 1890 to when he passed, 1913. So these are his ashes. And look at all the people here showing, you know, they understood his message. And this is the second part of his message. The first part was the horror that took place. This is his answer as he matured. He says, but you say you cannot appreciate beauty as I do. Have you tried? Have you tried as hard to appreciate the beauty of a field as to possess it? Have you tried 100th part as hard to appreciate beauty as you have to accumulate wealth? Have you given the subject 1 hour a day, 1 minute a day? Have you ever thought of it at all? You know, he's saying that the real poets of the world, and he says the real poets of the world never wrote a poem, never wrote a line. They were great observers, and they observed nature, and they observed the world, saw the beauty in it, and manifested that in their lives daily. That to him was what it was all about. And he says, I don't know if I put it in here, but he says if he could do anything at all as a teacher, this is it. He says, we proud, blind, and vain of our, it's the same passage as the last quote. We proud, blind, and vain of our knowledge of all books of men, know nothing of the source of all. Were I a great preacher or speaker of any kind, I would make it my mission to teach this one lesson to America, the love of the beautiful. So that was his solution, as far as possible, was to be an optimist. So he did go on tour. This is 1900. He says, lessons not found in books. And I don't think I put it in here, but there's a great quote of Miller's. He's asked, what about his books, and what about books, and what do you read, and what do you do? And he says, books are for people who can't think. That's what he said. He was a very outspoken man. I don't mean to make him out to be a great saint or anything, but he definitely had a perspective that we can learn from. And he's worthy of reading and understanding. So the children, I put this in here. This was a compatriot of his that painted this. I'm an art historian. I investigated all the early paintings of Mount Shasta, and it's a fascinating subject in and of itself. This is Ransom Holdridge. He was a friend, not a friend of Miller, but a fellow member of the Bohemian Club in San Francisco. And these kids here at the base of Mount Shasta, north side, kind of appropriate because it's the kids that Miller was talking about, especially in Life Amongst the Modocs and the massacre of children, trying to save the children. In Unwritten History, there's an illustrated edition in 1874, and I thought I'd show some pictures of it as we go on. Here is Joaquin Miller. This is the prince, is his tall friend, a very aristocratic miner. And these are some miners on Humbug Creek, which is up and behind Wairiki. You drop down to Humbug, and it was a big mining district. And in the book, Life Amongst Modocs, there's this brutal massacre and clubbing the children and the wives, and it just so described as if he were there, and I think he was there. At least he did participate in these kind of massacres. Anyway, and this is the other side of the story. It says on the bottom, we have to apologize. Our screen is progressively, the projector is progressively tilting downward, so we're losing the bottom of it. We're going to have to need to adjust that at some point. But anyway, you can see there's a massacre going on back here. This small group of Indians was bothering the miners in the Hubbub Creek area. The miners got really unruly and went in a mass kind of for some provocation and slaughtered this whole group of natives. And Miller and his friend the Prince saved 2 of the children and kind of raised them for several years in the story. And it's the other side of the story. So I'm just going to start going a little faster. This is a quote that I love from Picturesque California. It was a book published by John Muir, and Miller was hired to write 2 chapters. And he says, "My mountains must be free. They hurl oppression back. They keep the boon of liberty." He loved the outdoors. This area he's talking about, that was from this area. These are his books, 1854, 1868, 1869. I'll talk about that in a second. This is the Songs of the Sierras. So he wrote all these books. And I don't think anybody really realized how many books he wrote until we started publicizing this. But he wrote all the time. And he had kind of 2, these are the ones that are more defense of the Native Americans and his life amongst them. And this is his interim period, 1876, maybe all the way up to here. These 2 in particular, they have passages in there that would make, that would have been banned in the 20th century because of their explicit sexuality. He was a great lover, and for some reason, especially in this one called Baroness of New York, there are passages in there that just go, oh my God, you'd say that. This One Fair Woman, it's about 700 pages of chasing a woman around Italy. And he finally meets her. I mean, it's all this, and he never meet her the whole time. He just knows her, he sees her from afar, and he's just so focused on her. And it's so great. And he finally, by accident, comes to meet her at the top of Mount Vesuvius there in Italy. It's really it's a really kind of amusing. I thought a few things for those of you who don't know much about Miller. And the name, Joaquin et al. Means and all and others. It's a poem called Joaquin. And this man, C.H. Cincinnatus Heiner Miller, wrote it. So this is the little derivation of his name. He went to San Francisco, probably 1870 or so, and met Ina Coolbrith. I'll read this here. Joaquin Miller was born Cincinnatus Heiner Miller. He changed his name to Joaquin after becoming known as the author of Joaquin et al., which we just saw. A book of poems published in 1869. And he was so associated with that book of poems, this woman, with the poem, Joaquin romanticized the California bandit Joaquin Murrieta sometime around 1871. It should be 1870. Before Miller left America for England, Miller's close friend Ina Coolbrith, an influential California poetess, suggested to him that he use the name Joaquin. And he took the name Joaquin, went to Europe, and actually built himself up into a persona of the Wild West man, and became highly regarded as a poet and then as a novelist in England in the early 1870s, and it was only then that it came back to the U.S. and was accepted by the U.S. As a writer. Here's a picture from 1876. I thought you'd get a kick out of this. It's not a well-known photograph. It was an autographed card that came up for sale at an online auction. I didn't buy the card, but I snapped the picture off the internet. And he kind of looked for a little pretentious. Fortunately, the hat style has left us. I'm not too sure that works. This is Ina Coolbrith, great beauty, and I put this in here because Miller was associated, with beautiful women all his life. He really had this charisma, and he was lovers with her, but he brought his daughter, Callie Shasta, to her to be raised in San Francisco. Callie Shasta lived until she was 12 or 13 years old in the Cloud area. And then Miller had her taken to San Francisco and gave her to Ina to raise, which she did for many years. And then Callie Shasta passed away, they think, at a young age. The One Fair Woman, this is kind of his obsession with women. This is a picture of Joaquin Murrieta and the fanciful version from an early California artist. And we've already done that. I started throwing things together, late last night, so this gets a little random. But I was thinking about the horses. This is a picture from the 1880s, Sacramento Canyon, Mount Shasta distance. Just imagine what it was like to ride a horse. I mean, that was our mode of transportation. Horses were so integral to our county and Shasta County and Shasta Valley and Scott Valley. To ride around by horse, the horse was essential. Now, frequently you will hear that Miller's called a horse thief, stole a horse. And it's a complicated story, but and I think I show it here. The horses were almost a means of trade. So I'll just go over that quickly, because Mike Griffintini, I think, is going to do talking about Joaquin Miller's escapes. Another way to look at Miller, I'll just do it now. Over here in Scott Valley, this is Mount Shasta here, and there's a valley, you go up to Wairika and go into Scott Valley. Miller stole a horse from a man named Hearst, I think about 18, let's just say 57 or so. Stole a horse. The owner of the horse, Hearst, Miller was owed money by Hearst, so Miller stole Hearst's horse. Hearst gets a warrant, a constable, Bradley, and Hearst go chase Miller. Miller shoots and wounds the constable, tries to kill Hearst, and escapes and goes back to Oregon. Then Miller comes back and goes down to Shasta City, steals another horse in the process of trying to buy arms and ammunition for his Indian friends. He's trying to arm them. He's gone through many traumatic experiences. He's totally turned against the white culture, at least to help his Indian friends defend themselves. So he steals another horse, gets caught, gets put in jail, escapes from jail. So he steals a horse, he goes and shoots the constable, goes and steals another horse in the process of actually arming the Indians, which was probably against the law, and then gets out of jail. So you got at least 4 to 5 good crimes there, okay? So this guy's really an ex-con in a sense. But it's kind of a Robin Hood nature, at least the way he bills himself to be that way. But think about it, there's somebody that really did some heavy-duty work in the criminal vein. And then later on, in the 1950s or so, people were evaluating Miller, and they say, well, he never did any of this stuff. But these indictments, these warrants, these things still exist. And he really lived the life. And yet, here's in a sense, a common criminal who becomes a world-famous writer. I think it's just an amazing story if you look at the dichotomy there. It's pretty cool. So the massacre, we're not going to talk about too much. It's really essential. Let's see what we can do. I've got 4 minutes to do it all. The Diaries is fascinating. He talks about in 1856, he left his horse down in American Ranch area down in Shasta, down by Redding, and so he goes to get it back. He finds out that they've taken it, this man Freeman. He went down after considerable noise, and Deuce Freeman was able to come up with the truth. That was that they had his horse over in Battle Creek. They gave me a horse to ride. Sunset. After such a quarrel as I never hope to see again, I was mounted bareback on my horse, galloping away for home. So his early introduction to the horse life here is that his horse was stolen. So when he goes and steals horses later, you can kind of understand the continuity there, that this was something that people did. He witnessed all these amazing things. That's another painting by the same artist that did his portrait. Did the world ever stop to consider how an Indian who has no theater, no saloon, no whiskey shop, no parties, no newspaper, not one of all of our hundreds of ways and means of amusement, that's a long sentence, but it's a good one, spends his evening? Think of this. Punctuation marks are very essential to Miller's style of writing. He is a human being full of passion and of poetry. His soul must find some expression, his heart some utterance. The long, long nights of darkness without any lighted city to walk about in or books to read. Think of that. This is from 1873. And it's that quiet that he experienced that filled his soul with something special. And the rest of his life, when he built this spiritual community above Oakland, he talks, it's all about the sense of peace. It's all about the sense of quiet that he experienced there. That kind of was the teacher, that was what was happening there at that community. Miller, there's a lot of aspects. Miller was the mentor. He met this young Japanese man who came to live from Japan. And this man, Yoni, he wasn't a poet, but Miller mentored him. He became a poet, and he's the man that introduced the haiku style of poetry to English language. So there is this mentorship. There's all these little individual mentorships. I think I'm going to have to stop there. I'm just kind of giving you a touch. We haven't really got to the core conflicts that Miller experienced, but that's okay. You can read the exhibition, and all these wonderful talks we'll have the rest of the weekend should fill in quite a bit. This is a photograph by a San Francisco photographer, and I think it just captures, the Mount Shasta region in its fullness and in its beauty. It's all in there. Thanks so much for listening.
Hi. Just as a little background, since I'm Scott Valley resident, and a lot of you may not be familiar with me, I'm a former teacher. I graduated with a degree in anthropology and minors in English and history. But as I explained to a few people, I don't consider myself a true historian because I married into a fourth generation cattle ranch, and that family, of course, has got deep roots. And so I consider myself a chronicler. I love to collect history. I love to read and write and find a venue for the incredible stories that exist in this region. They're all too quickly disappearing. Betty Hall is a very good friend of mine, and her daughter and I co-authored The History of Western Siskiyou County Golden Dreams. And so a lot of the material that I'm pulling together today about mining and the early mining will probably be more focused on western Siskiyou County, because the information is massive and, of course, very controversial, but at the same time, it is part of our history. And so that's where I'm going to pretty much focus my presentation. All right. Obviously, it was a gold rush. The mother lode, of course, came first, the 49ers. But the move to the north happened very much on the heels of the mother lode. And it's interesting in history that you don't see a lot about the northern mines, and yet we actually produced more gold than did the Sierra mother lode. So this is just a simple map of the Siskiyou and Trinity counties in the northern region. All right, so hearing there was gold, the 49ers moved north. It's been recorded in Harry Wells's History of Siskiyou County that probably the first gold miners logged were Lindsay Applegate, who came down from Oregon in about 1849 and mined along the Klamath and Scott Rivers. Also, in 1849, miners began to move up into the region of Shasta, or Old Shasta City, which of course became a very important city. It was also otherwise known as the Queen City. It became the gateway to the back country and became very important. This picture dates back to about the 1860s, 1870s, but it was built in 1850. Obviously, roads leading north were quite few, and the terrain was very, very rough. This is a picture of a freight team near Shasta City. Pretty rugged country. The first gold seekers came on foot or by mule. This picture is very old. My co-writer on 4 of the books I've done on State of Jefferson, Bernita Tickner, she just recently passed away. In fact, she passed away a week before our last book was released. And this is her father and her grandfather, and she died at 86. So this is a great photo. I love it. I think it's an awesome picture. It shows not only the terrain, but just the conditions of living in those days. The early gold seekers followed the waterways. Many moved up the Klamath River from the mouth. Many moved down the coast from Oregon or up the coast. Then they began to take the trails, and I know Richard Silva is going to be talking about trails, and he's quite the trail expert. But the 2 predominant trails from the coast into our region were the Waldo or Horace Gasky Trail and Kelsey Trail. I'll mention those in a little while too. Also, around the same time, from 1849, as Shasta City grew quickly, in fact, in the first 6 months, over 500 men created a tent city at the site of what became Shasta City. The miners also crossed over into the Trinities as early as June of 1850. And of course, Trinity was an extremely rich and gold-bearing area, and Weaverville has its roots, of course, in the gold rush as well. This was the home of Squirrel Gem. He was a Shasta Indian who lived to be well over 100 years old. And he helped a lot of the early miners, and he helped locate some of the first gold that was discovered along the river, and this was his cabin. He was buried near Etna. Of course, this is Wairika in its early days, and ironically, the largest gold discovery took place on dry land versus the waterways, which is where all the miners were headed. And Abraham Thompson and his crew came into the area, camped at a place called Wairika Flats, and he did a little scratching, and as he scratched away, he discovered gold hanging from the grass, and it opened up Wairika area for immediate discovery. And within the year, over 5,000 miners came to the Wairika area. Miners immediately set up tent camps. This is probably from the 1890s. This photograph was from our family history. But this is very typical of the little tents and the tent cities that they would build. And of course, water became as valuable as gold. And transporting water, of course, as the miners began to do more hard rock mining and trying to sluice water. And of course, the big ditch that traveled around the hills to Wairika. But then also just clean water was a very, very precious commodity. Miners lived on beans, bacon, and coffee. Coffee, bacon, and beans. I love this photograph because this is actually flour from the Charles Jenner flour mill, which is my husband's family's flour mill. You can probably see it there in the bag. So, and this was not one of our photos, but when I found it, I got pretty excited. Joaquin Miller, who of course lived in Humbug, as Bill pointed out, wrote about the day of a life of a miner, and he wrote, "Now the smoke from the low chimneys of the log cabins began to rise and curl through the clear, cool air on every hand, and the miners to come out at the low doors, great, hairy, bearded, 6-foot giants, hatless, half-dressed, stretched themselves in the sweet, frosty air, shouted to each other in a sort of savage banter, washed their hands and faces in the gold pan that stood by the door, then entered their cabins again to partake of the eternal beans and bacon and coffee and bacon and beans." Everything had to be packed in by mules. This was part of the Bennett Packing Company, and these mules were so well trained that they would walk up to their saddles and wait. They knew exactly which saddle was theirs. And many times, they traveled 300 miles. The pack strings would number from 30 to 60. In one article, it was reported that over 1,000 mules headed out of Shasta City in one day. So they were the mode of transportation. Many of the miners, of course, had little more than shovels or picks, but then they began to use the long toms and the sluices, which of course required more water. But then they began to band in what they called companies, groups of 5 or 8 miners, and by doing that they could extract more than 5 to 10 times as much gold. Again, packing and freighting was a major business throughout the region. Whoops. And this is in Sawyers Bar, and the hotel back there was one of the stage stops, or one of the stops along the way, the route for people moving into the region. These are actually freight horse teams, and the freighting became extremely important. In 1852, Jacob Wagner wrote to his sister and brother back in Iowa and wrote, "There are about 4,000 or 5,000 persons in Shasta Butte City, Wairika, and within 10 miles of here, some living in brush houses, others in tents. There are about 30 stores and about the same number of gambling houses and liquor shops. We are 300 miles from navigation. The provisions we get here have to be packed in on mules. At present, flour is 25 cents a pound, beans 20 cents, coffee 50 cents, butter is $1.25, and boots cost $8 to $16 a pair. Potatoes run 25 cents a pound, liquor is 50 cents a drink." So it was not cheap to live in these rough places. Again, here are the mules lining up, waiting to be packed. This is the McBroom Packing Company, and the McBrooms, the Bennetts, the Georges in western Siskiyou County and Salmon River area, those families still live on, and this is a rich part of their history. Many of them intermarried. Most of the miners in the first days took Indian wives, and so their heritage is very, very mixed. This was Forest House near Wairika. This is a modern day picture. I do have one old picture of the original Forest House, but it's so overgrown with trees and everything you can hardly see anything. But of course the Forest House became very important, not only to travelers and as the roads developed, but also to the local economy. And my father-in-law's father my grandfather-in-law, I guess, they used to drive pigs from Scott Valley through McAdams Creek, and they would stop at Forest House and stay the night. And then they would drive the pigs. I can't imagine driving pigs. Drive the pigs to the railroad station in Gazelle. But if you've ever worked with pigs, they don't drive. So I've always wondered how they managed to do that. Grain, yeah. We used to raise pigs commercially. We don't do it anymore. There's not much market in it for right now. And this is a Callahan Ranch Hotel, which was first built in the 1850s by Matthias Callahan. If you haven't been over there to Callahan lately, you need to go, because a fellow has purchased this as his own private residence, but he is completely restoring it. And it is truly, truly awesome, and what a gift to the community. And he does take people on tours. The Forks of Salmon, of course, is located at the confluence of the North and South Forks. And the area here is pretty steep and rugged, but Forks of Salmon became an important mining community. You can see how steep the bluffs here are near the forks. And in bad weather, stormy weather, it must have been a pretty harrowing experience. If you've ever read the book Bellboy, it's a story of the freight trains and packers moving, and the boy who rings the bell. And it's a great tribute to their hardiness. Here's Sawyers Bar, which became a tremendous hub in the Salmon River area and continued to be a hugely important community. This again is another pack string getting ready to go out. This is the hotel in Sawyers Bar, and still a community that exists, even though it's much reduced, of course. Sawyers Bar was established a mile up the river from the first settlement on the Salmon River, which was called Bestville. And Bestville was established by a sea captain, Captain Best, and his crew, who began to mine for gold. But it didn't last as long, of course, as Sawyers Bar. This is Sawyers Bar in a 4th of July parade around the turn of the century. And there's another picture that goes along with this, which I couldn't find, but it's a wonderful picture because the men are dressed up as women and as women suffragettes, and they're pretty hysterical with all of their costuming. But Sawyers Bar remained an important town, definitely for another 50 years or more. And the hotel was the hub of the community there. If you've ever been to Sawyers Bar, the little church there is established. It was established in 1855 by an Austrian monk, and he came over and built the church, and it resides on the only piece of property in Sawyers Bar that was never mined. So it's considered to be the richest little church. The Catholic Church still holds services there through the summer. Every couple of months, the priest goes over and the community gathers, and a lot of people from Scott Valley go over there and celebrate Mass and celebrate the little church. So it's still there. Black Bear Mine, which was a quartz mine, is located on the South Fork of the Salmon River. Many of you maybe have heard of the Black Bear community, which grew up in the 60s as sort of a hippie outpost. Well, that's the same location as Black Bear Mine. It was probably it was one of the most prolific mines of the area. And they also established a lumber mill alongside the mine, which was quite common because the miners needed timbers. They needed lumber, of course, for their buildings, also for the flumes. Most of the flumes were constructed of wood planking, Some of the massive projects that they undertook were amazing. The equipment that had to be packed into Black Bear, which is quite a ride, was packed in by mules, and these mules would carry in pipes and all kinds of incredible equipment to be used. They would construct the stamp mills and everything on site, but the mules had to be used to carry in the equipment. There are stories about the families that would come by mule, for instance, over the Trinities and over into Scott Valley. They would pack the children in the saddlebags on the sides of the mules. But that's how reliable these animals were. Deep mining, of course, required a tremendous amount of machinery. This device was an Arastra, and whoops, I keep hitting that, sorry. It consisted of a shallow stone-lined pit with a post, and many times the post was actually a tree that had been cut to size. A horizontal cross beam was attached to the center post so it could turn, and one or more large stones called drags were placed in the pit and attached to the cross beam by chains or ropes. And the ore was broken into smaller fragments which could then be thrown into the pit and then crushed. And so obviously this took a lot of timber. You can see how much wood was involved in this construction. And again, a tremendous amount of labor. This is John Daggett, who was the owner of the Black Bear mine. He actually sold it at one point. He owned it for 7 or 8 years. Again, very, very prolific mine. He then purchased the mine about 13 years later. John Daggett went on to become the lieutenant governor of the state of California and also the superintendent of mines. His daughter Hallie Daggett, if you aren't familiar with her, but anyone in the Forest Service certainly is, became the first woman lookout in the forest. And she's a fascinating, fascinating character. But he himself was a fascinating man. He sold the mine eventually in 1872, when at that point in time, the mine was producing over $10,000 worth of gold a month. But it's interesting, John Daggett was a real friend to the Chinese. There's a story that he was in San Francisco on business, and his wife sent a telegram that some of the Irish miners were harassing his Chinese employees. And so instead of being able to rush back to the scene, he sent a gunslinger. And the gunslinger stepped off the stage, and the bartender told the miners, "This guy just cleaned out Bodie, Wyoming." And Daggett never had any more trouble. And this is one of Daggett's hired Chinese housemen. I think it's interesting to notice his shoes. On my husband's family's ranch, of course, later on, a lot of the Chinese took jobs with the ranching families. My husband's family's Chinese cook lived his entire life there on the ranch and became a part of the family. But Petersburg was one of the largest settlements along the South Fork, and it was one of the largest settlements of Chinese communities. And in fact, it was the only part of the community to survive when the hydraulic mining came in and reduced the area to rubble at the turn of the century. This was a bill to John Daggett from A.H. Denny. And if any of you are familiar with the Denny bar stores, they were actually the first chain stores in California. I'll show you an early picture of one of the stores. And I think it's kind of interesting. It says, "Dear Sir, enclosed find freight recently packed for in yourself. We credit the account to BBC, or Black Bear Mining Company, $16.49. Damaged again. Please send us the check for amount due. Money is very scarce on this site, and every little helps. Regarding the goods from the cache, we have heard nothing of them. Our teams start on the last trip today. If goods are there, they will probably, I can't read that last word, be there. Yours truly, A.H. Denny. This was in 1885. I have a whole register of old receipts that came to Black Bear Mine. Of course, blacksmiths were incredibly important. This is Dan Davis in Sawyers Bar. When he first began working as a blacksmith, he didn't have an anvil. You'll see that he does have an anvil here. But they used rocks on which to temper the points of the picks and the shovels. And he would charge $1 a point. So not a bad wage for those days. Obviously, large numbers of Chinese settled along the Salmon River. There were thousands, actually, who came into the region. A lot of people don't realize how many Chinese were included in the populations. They were not necessarily included in the census, and so we don't always have an accurate count. Near Deadwood right now, well, they just finished the summer. They did a dig. I got to go out. I don't know if you're familiar with that dig. They found a Chinese camp near where Deadwood camp was, and it was pretty extensive. It was fun. This is the Morrison Carlock mine in Quartz Valley, Scott Valley, near Orofino. It produced over $470,000 worth of gold. And remember, we're talking money from those days. This is what the reported amount was. It had the longest chute of any mine in Siskiyou County. And it was an extremely profitable mine. Carlock, I'll note in a minute, was an important person in Siskiyou County history, especially in Scott Valley. He's the man who started Scott Valley Bank, which is the oldest single bank in the state of California. This is the Asa Howard House in Mugginsville. Mugginsville was named for a game called Muggins that the miners often played. This was a stage stop. It was built in the 1850s, actually, I think 1852. Unfortunately, right now, that house is being torn down because there was no way to restore it, and the people who own it tried to get historical money. They tried in every way to move it, but it was so rambleshack that it came down. Interestingly, the Howard family had the second white child born in Siskiyou County, a young son. This is the cheap cash store. The photo itself is so dark you can hardly see it, so I apologize. This is around 1888. This is up near Henley, which became Cottonwood Creek was a large mining area, and that Klamath River area became an incredibly popular place to mine. Horace Gasky ran pack trains from the coast to Happy Camp. He employed hundreds of Chinese. He also worked with the Chinese to a large degree, and he's the man for whom the Gasky Trail was named, and it was one of two trails that came from Crescent City. Pretty arduous travel. Indian Town, located up Indian Creek, also became a thriving mining camp in the 1850s. The town's population jumped to over 450, while nearby Happy Camp remained only at 100. But part of that reason was because of this trail that passed through. Here's a picture of unloading freight from what they called mountain schooners in Weaverville. Freight was hauled 50 miles over mountain roads, highest elevations 4,000 feet. Each wagon carried about 8,000 pounds. So as the original trails, which had been the native tribe trails and then early trapping trails from the Hudson Bay Company, that's the trails the first miners used. they began to develop roads where they could take these large schooners through. This was one of 2 Chinese stores in Happy Camp, and Happy Camp became an extremely important location in the mining era. This store was called the China Store. Was owned by Ah Hock, who also owned a number of mines and employed his own laborers. But all stores there were supplied by the China Bow pack train. A second Chinese store was owned by the Kong brothers, and it was famous for its Chinese candy and Chinese whiskey. By 1880, Happy Camp's population was 250. Chinese population was 250 out of 600 people. The Indian population numbered 97. And of course, the conflicts continued through this period tremendously between the native tribes and the miners, who had absolutely no sympathy for them. Other businesses included, this was the original Cudahy Hotel in Happy Camp by Martin Cudahy. He was an important early settler in Happy Camp. One important form of mining activity that began to take place as the miners really settled in and began to move past just the stream bed panning and the simple sluices were wing dams. You can see the amount of wood that was built or needed to build these wing dams, and they were pretty fascinating. It was built out of lumber, out of willow or small trees, and it extended into the river about 75 feet and then turned downstream about 130 feet and then back to shore. So they're pretty massive. It formed a large rectangular enclosure, and first they pumped all the water out of that enclosure, and then they would, that riverbed would lay exposed, and they would sluice it, and, derricks were used to lift the gravel in and out, and also lift out the boulders. And then after they washed the gold out of the gravel, they used what was called Chinese pumps, which were devised by the Chinese miners, and they helped to remove the water from the riverbed. Then afterwards, they would restructure it so that the water would flow back into the river. In 1872, this was written about wing dam operation. It was published in the Wairika Journal. Just below the junction of Scott River on the Klamath River, Mr. Learned is carrying on one of the largest mining operations in that section of the country. He has used over 49,000 feet of lumber and has a flume conveying water from the Scott River carrying about 1,000 inches of water for the purpose of running 2 overshot wheels. Altogether, there are 4 wheels, 2 overshot and 2 river wheels with 3 pumps in operation. They each have a capacity of pumping 100 inches of water each. The derrick is also run by water power. The mast is 60 feet in length and the boom 70 feet, and it is supported by wire. You can see the wire in this photo. Where the wing dam is built, the water in places is 18 feet deep with a very strong current. He has in his employ 40 men who make up quite a mining camp. So pretty involved process. I love this photograph. I found this one and purchased it from an antique store. And when I found out that it was all written on the back from the Highland Mine. Anyway, it was located, the Highland Mine was a very important mine. It was located about 11 miles southeast of Etna and in what they called the Liberty Mining District. They extracted about $80,000 in gold in 1899, and it consisted of a series of tunnels. This was the superintendent of the mine, Bart Mattern. And you notice his guns and his knife and his He's standing pretty proudly. I think it's pretty interesting. The mine encompassed 100 acres and ran a 10-stamp mill. Now, the stamp mills, of course, the Black Bear mine at one point ran a 32-stamp mill. That's a tremendous amount of pounding and stamping in terms of reducing the rock and getting to the ore. It employed 26 men and was said to have produced $350,000 in 1916. Again, supplies had to come in by pack trains, and it was a pretty significant mine. Here are miners going to the Highland mine and crossing over the snow-packed ridges was quite a feat. I want you to notice the snowshoes on the mule. These were devised by Bill Balfrey's grandfather. I have one, and I foolishly didn't bring it. He gave it to me several years ago. If you've ever visited with Bill Balfrey, he lives in Weed, actually. His wife, Willow, is quite an artist. But he has a whole PowerPoint and video presentation on snowshoes and the mules going through the mountains. But these mules would actually wear snowshoes. Okay, gold mining camps, of course, were rough and tumble, and there weren't very many women, especially in the early days. As I said, most of the men, or many of the men, took Indian wives, especially along the Klamath River, the Karuk women, and then in the valley, the Shasta women were many times either purchased or married into. This is a McBroom. She is from the Salmon River country, and she is part Shasta and Karuk. But I love her outfit, and truly the girls learned to be tough, especially in that part of the country. There's a cute story that took place along Humbug in 1853 that was reported. A group of miners were headed to the creek, and they suddenly saw a line, a clothesline, and they noticed that these were women's garments. And they were so caught up with the moment, they could not believe there was a woman in any proximity. And so the next day, there was dozens and dozens and dozens of men standing outside the cabin, waiting for a glimpse of the woman. And finally, the man came out and said, "What are you doing here?" And they said, "All we want to do is see her." And so she and her child came out, and they bowed to her, and they yelled and clapped and gave her all of this incredible applause. And then one of the old miners, he was called Old Uncle Albert, and he told the woman and her husband, "My dear sir, you can be assured that your wife and child will be sacred objects to us, and as safe from insult or danger as they would be within the limits of the capital of our country, surrounded by an army of police. We bid you welcome, and may God bless you, your wife, and child." So that was their first sighting of a woman in probably several years. This is one of the early Denny Bar and Parker stores. I mentioned to you that the Denny Bar stores were actually the first known chain stores in California. There was over 8 of them. Originally, they were the Denny Bar store, and then Parker came on. And we don't have a location, but we believe this one is actually either Forks of Salmon or possibly the old town of Denny. It's a great old shot, and this is a very old photograph. Again, this was my friend Bernita Tickner's photograph, and it's from her family. The Admiral Dewey mine was near Gazelle, and it was a hard rock mine where they had to go in and carve out the rock and then bring it out. Kind of an interesting photograph, not one you see very much around here. Hard rock mining, of course, required digging, and they removed what they called the pay quartz. and then the gold would be extracted from that quartz through milling or crushing. And of course, the real criminal activity came along with the hydraulic mining, which became an incredibly profitable but damaging form of mining. We still see the results of it everywhere in our region. This is in Trinity County, which actually had probably some of the largest and some of the most devastating effects of hydraulic mining. This is an interesting certificate of residence. The Chinese immigration soared in spite of the prejudice, of course, until the Exclusion Acts later on. But this was a miner up McAdams Creek. And it's sort of interesting to note the history of the discussion about the Chinese. They always called it the Chinese question or the Chinese problem. Actually, there was a whole number of newspapers who rallied behind the Chinese. Local newspapers here, Wairika Journal and the Union. Okay. Both Republican papers were very much in favor of supporting the Chinese. The Wairika Union, however, truly opposed any kind of settlement of Chinese. Even Bret Hart, who considered himself to be somewhat sympathetic, wrote some devastating diatribe against the Chinese. A.B. Carlock, the second man from the left, was well respected by the Chinese miners. I did the research for the 150th anniversary for the Scott Valley Bank and spent, 100 hours going through everything having to do with Carlock. Was fascinated by the fact that he not only supported them, but he traded very fairly with them, and they truly respected him. This was a Chinatown in Happy Camp, and every community had its Chinatown. Wairika actually had two, both of which burned up at various times in various fires. And Etna had a Chinatown down off China Hill. If you've ever been to the Etna pub, the brewery there, that's China Hill. And this was the Wong Ok Sing Chop House in Etna. Very, very profitable business, and this is a rare photograph. In fact, the museum had never seen this photograph. This was one of Bernita's. And interestingly, in Chinese lore, you always want your restaurant or building your business to be up, because evil spirits cannot go up, and they can't go down. So, for instance, if a restaurant goes up, that's very good, or goes down, very good, but not on the ground level. Certainly, as mines played out, many of the Chinese took jobs on farms and ranches. This old miner was employed in Fort Jones. Again, Trinity County had some of the largest hydraulic mines. I have several shots here. This was one in Scott Valley. There were 229 hydraulic mines listed in 1898. This one was in Happy Camp, the Van Brunt, and it was a very, very large mine. In fact, this is where the airport is now. Here's a giant, the nozzles, and again in Trinity County. And the Lorenz mine, another large one in Trinity County. These are some children at the Salmon River School. I included this because I just wanted to talk about how rough life was for women and children in those days. Disease was rampant. Diphtheria and cholera went through the camps, wiped out families. Not huge numbers in our area, but significant numbers. And I love this photograph of the two little kids. You can see how muddy the ground was. And then the dredges came in. This is the Yuba dredge near Callahan. This is my husband's grandmother standing there. And interestingly, this dredge only traveled a total of 4 miles in 14 years. But what was sad was with all that work, most of the gold was lost. It was either too fine or too big. And the men would actually watch the gold going up, and over. And here again is the dredge a few years later. And there were a number of dredges in Scott Valley. There were a number of dredges on the Klamath River as well. And so here are a few of the hundreds of mines in the Northern District. I certainly haven't even begun to touch on many of them, but it was a significant part of the history of this region. And out of it, we have a controversial history, but certainly a history that has led to where we are now.
My name's Linda Wallace, and I taught for about 20 years, and Kathy taught in Weed the same amount of time that I have, and I taught until God decided to send me a different direction. I went over to Australia to teach, and I left here in the snow, hit there in the 98% humidity, and ended up with MS. And so life has set me on a different path, but still teaching and giving people lots of information that I just teach in a different way. So anyway, Kathy and I, this story I used to tell to my class, and I wrote every day with them, because if you're expecting kids to write every day, then I think as a teacher you must also write, because then you pattern that. And we would write for 10 minutes in total silence and then share after that. And that, after I got sick, one day I thought, well, what am I going to do with my life? So then my first book, and can you hold it up, Kathy? Became Stories of Pure Love, to awaken memories of people who have loved you. And so those were stories actually that I wrote when I was teaching. I would write and the kids would write. And then, like I said, this story, which I read from Joaquin Miller's Life Amongst the Modocs in 1873, I used to tell them the story, and so then I decided that it needed to be one that could be saved, because all the things that all of us have stories, great stories, and those stories need to be preserved. And so I wanted this one to be so that children would be able to enjoy it. And in Joaquin Miller's, the original one, if you go back, it's very, very dramatic and not nice. So anyway, I changed it so it would be easily read. And I thought some students from Chico State were coming, and so that's also why I put that in. But anyway, Kathy is an amazing artist, and Kathy, do you want to say something just about the pictures real quick?
Oh, I'll just say that, well, I've been an artist all my life, and actually I was born in Weaverville and grew up on the Trinity River at Big Bar, and so I had a lot of mining. Gail, I lived right next door to a hydraulic mine when I was a little girl, and that was in the 50s. And I am part, I also, one of my ancestors was a German trapper who came in on the Klamath and married a Karuk, and she was my great-great-grandmother. But anyway, Linda and I, she saw my work and she said, well, you know, I've had this book forever, and I really need somebody to illustrate it.
If I'm going to interrupt for a second, because this is actually an 8.5 by 11 sheet. When it got pulled out, it looks like it got wide. And I really want these things to look like they should. So I'm going to see if this will make a difference.
So anyway, basically it took me about 1.5 years to do these drawings.
What we did is, because I always had a science background and a love for nature, and the love that the Indians have for nature, I wanted this book to be a real teaching tool. So on each page I wanted to have animal somewhere, and then its tracks for the children or adults to follow and understand and learn about the track that the animal makes. And also all of the plants and trees that we have in this area. So as we figured out what we were going to do, then we talked together and came up with our ideas, and Kathy did more than I even imagined. And I think that's the greatest part, when two people collaborate together and great things come out of it. So the book really is as much a adult book as it is a child's book, because at the end of it you'll see there is 4 pages that have the actual searching for you to get the answers on the pages. And so, are we there?
Not yet. It's just they're getting pulled out really messed up the connection.
Uh-oh.
I think the best thing to do, let's see, we're going to restart the computer. I think that's...
Well, I want to say that writing has always been a love for me. I think I wrote my first story. In fact, I've got a lot of books that are all in the making. The one book, it's Gardenia, the runt pig. I've done the pictures on it, but I didn't quite finish them all, and so hopefully I'm going to be able to. As you'll find out, my son also, he is much better an artist than I am, and he travels all over the world right now. He is a project manager now on a refinery that's in Russia, and it's actually a holding facility for crude that's coming from Africa, which he was in the Congo and in I'm trying to think of the other town in Africa, and they are getting that all the way from there to Russia to be held there, which is pretty interesting. Anyway, he keeps me kind of always learning about what the world situations are, and of course with it having to do with gasoline, then it's, you know, he's very in the know of what's going on. But anyway, he is an excellent artist, and I tried to get him to do the artwork, but he just goes, I don't have time, Mom, I'm too busy, you know, because he works in Africa, well, he was in Africa, but now he's in Russia. He works 29 days on and 29 days off. So then he comes home, and he just had a little daughter who is 7 months old, so that's pretty exciting. Okay, so let's go on. Here we are at the very beginning. All right, next one. We dedicated the book to children and to adults, and to our own children, and because we want them educated. So and you can read that later. Now, this is when Brett was in high school, he drew that picture, And so I wanted to include it because it's a wonderful, he's very artistic. And on the one side, you'll see it gives you information about Joaquin Miller. And if you get the book, you can read it. But do you want to go on? And this is the one that that Bill read too. The Indian was with whom I lived in the California Sierra held the grizzly bear in great respect and veneration. He venerated the grizzly bears as his potential ancestor, and that's, I mean paternal, and that's how this book came about. Many moons ago, a great storm came to the summit of Mount Shasta. The white peak pierced the sky, was home to the Great Spirit and his family. His lodge was inside the mountain. The Great Spirit spoke to his youngest and fairest daughter. Climb to the top of the mountain. Speak to the storm that comes from the sea. Be gentle, or it will blow the mountain over. Do this hastily, said the Great Spirit. Do not put your head out, or lest the wind catch your hair and blow you away. Thrust your long and red arm and make a sign. Speak softly to the storm to calm it. I need to move just a little. That's all right. The Indian princess hastened to the top of the lodge to do as she was told. Having never seen the ocean where she was born, where the wind was born, she dared to lift her head out of the hole in the mountain. Lo, the storm caught her long red hair and caught her and lifted her out. Down the mountain she tumbled. She could not fix her feet in the hard, smooth ice and snow. On and on she tumbled past the white fur below the snow rim. Now the grizzly bear tribe possessed all the woods and land to the sea. They were more numerous and very, very powerful. The bears walked upright on two legs. They were more like humans than beasts. They lived in caves and had sharp claws. The tribe used clubs to fight instead of using their teeth and claws. And Kathy, oh, this is a close-up of some of the pictures. We'll be seeing that as we go through. A family of grizzlies lived close to the snow line. When old Father Grizzly went hunting each day, he would return carrying his club in one hand and an elk over his shoulder. By chance, he noticed a small creature with red skin and red hair trailing in the snow. The creature was crouched beneath a fir bush, shivering, cold, terrified of the huge beast. And here he is. Old Father Grizzly didn't know what to make of her. He took her to old Mother Grizzly, who was learned in all things. This child belongs to the Great Spirit, said Mother Grizzly. We will not tell him about her. Mother Grizzly always got her way. Leave this child with me. I will raise her with the other children. Do not say anything about her to anyone. Each day, old Father Grizzly went out to hunt food for his family. Before long, the children were grown. Now, the Indians in our areas always wore the baskets on their head, and so we had to put that in. Our oldest son is quite grown up. He needs a wife, said Mother Grizzly. Let him take the little red creature you found in the snow as his wife. Old Father Grizzly kissed her and said, You are very wise. Raising his club to his shoulder, he went to hunt for meat for the marriage feast. The grizzly bear's son and the Indian princess were married. They were very happy. Many children were born to them. Being part of the Great Spirit and part of the grizzly bear tribe, the children did not look like either of their parents. Thus, the red men was created. These children were the first Native Americans. And there they are, with all their baskets.
And that's the camas
Camas flower.
They use the root.
And of course, we have the otter here, river otter.
Linda, you might point out how accurate the botany is in these drawings. They're just marvelous local flora.
As you get to the very back of the book, then there's a key that tells you all of them. So that then you can take the child and yourself back to the book and look more carefully at it. All the grizzly bear tribe throughout the giant forest, even down to the sea, were very proud and kind to the red men. United in strength and power, they built a wigwam close to the Great Spirit's lodge for the princess. This was known as Little Mount Shasta or Shastina. Many years passed. Old Mother Grizzly grew very old. She became ill and was sure to die. Fear filled her very being for the wrong that she had done to the Great Spirit. She knew she could not rest. And most must speak to the Great Spirit. Sorry, it's often. The Indian princess, had to be returned. I must ask for his forgiveness, she thought. Mother Grizzly gathered together all the grizzly bear tribe at the new magnificent lodge built for the princess and her children. She sent her oldest grandson up the summit of Mount Shasta in a cloud to speak to the Great Spirit. You will find your long-lost daughter at Shastina, the new lodge lower on the mountain, spoke the grandson to the Great Spirit. The Great Spirit was glad of this. He ran down the south side of the mountain so fast and strong, the snow melted off in places, just as it remains today. The grizzly bear tribe, numbering in the thousands, went out to greet the Great Spirit. As he approached, they stood apart in two great lines, carrying clubs under their arms. He passed through the lines of bears to his daughter, who sat inside the new lodge with her children. Great Spirit was very angry. The grizzly bear tribe whom he had created had betrayed him. Those do not look like my daughter's children. You have created a new race, roared the Great Spirit. Please forgive me, Great Spirit, she pleaded. At that moment, she lay very still. No longer could she take a breath. Then old Mother Grizzly entered the flower trail to the west. Instantly, the entire grizzly bear tribe set up a dreadful howl. Now, if you go back and read the original, you'll see what Joaquin Miller said. It was quite violent. And there she is, going up to heaven. The Great Spirit took his daughter. He raised his hand to leave and said, "You grizzlies must hold your tongue. Get down on your hands and haunches. You will remain this way forever." As he turned to look, all the bears were on all fours. He closed the door to the lodge. All the red men's children went out into the world, never to return to the snow-covered mountain again. And the yellow, what is that, Kathy?
That's the Wokus flower. Actually, you know, when I first started doing the research for the plants and everything, I kind of took the Modoc tribe literally. And actually, I didn't know that Joaquin Miller hadn't really, you know, when he talked about the Modocs, he wasn't really talking about that tribe in particular, I don't think. It was more, he was more down this way with the Shasta and the Wintu. But most of the plants here are traditional Modoc plants. And they ate the seeds. They harvested the Wokas seeds for their food.
And of course, the sagebrush, which is there in the corner. There was sage. I was from Modoc County. I was raised on a ranch, and yes, I knew about pigs. We had pigs and we had lots of sheep, and sheep are very dumb. Anyway, as proof of this story, all the grizzly bear tribe can no longer raise up or use their clubs. They are cursed to walk on all fours, much like other beasts. When they must fight, the Great Spirit has granted them permission to stand up and fight with their fists, as men do. That is why the Native Americans of Mount Shasta will never kill or interfere in any way with the grizzlies. Whenever one of their numbers is killed by one of the kingly beasts of the forest, he is burned on the spot. All who pass that way for years will cast a stone on the place until a great pile is thrown up. Now, if you've ever gone up on a plain, you'll see all these piles all over, but they're really, when the mountain erupted, then there is all these piles that you think, oh my goodness. So both are kind of true. Question? No. Today there are no grizzlies on Mount Shasta. The grizzly bear once walked upright like men, was with scarcely any tail. Their arms were shorter than their legs. They were more like men than any other animal. And there he is. And here's our plant identification and uses for children and adults. And when I was teaching, I always used the Pacific Coast Tree Finder, and then we'd go out and find and key out the tree, which is a great resource for any of you to have. Which, can they get them at the Forest Service? Can they buy them? I can't remember where I got mine. Here's more uses. I love the wild strawberry. It's up on Mount Shasta, easily to find. I used to take my class up there. And then here's the animal tracker, so that you can match all the animals with the tracks. And when I was teaching, I would have, when I was teaching a first grade class, we did a science experiment where the kids all went out and did a plaster Paris cast, and that became my science project, which was great. And there's Kathy and I with our information. And here's the ending. It gets more information about how Joaquin Miller was over in the McLeod area and how he married one of the Indians there. And then the last was the, by Brett's picture, is more exactly the same one that Bill had read this morning. So then we have the end of the book. It's coming, that's the one that we read. And at the end, we asked some help to give us some praise, and so Bill did, and Dennis and Glee Brooks. And any questions about how we did anything concerning the book? Kathy, do you want to say anything more?
Maybe only about maybe I should go back. It doesn't go back. Oh, it does. I used graph paper to design the plants as if they were being woven in a basket. And then I used the realistic part of the plant at the bottom. That's why it looks stylized. Like that's sagebrush, kind of taken apart and broken down into squares. And the same way with the Wokas. That's yarrow. And Thule. I was just fortunate enough to spend some time up in Valley Falls, near Paisley, where my mom was born in Valley Falls, and I saw a lot of tule up there. Valley Falls, you go to Lakeview and then you go north. It's on 395, where Highway 31 takes off.
Are there any questions for the speakers? Well, thank you very much. Those were
Okay, good morning. I use this as I sent this to Obama when he got elected, either to depress him or encourage him. I don't know. This is a poem that Gertrude wrote in 1918 for the Birth Control Review. But I just used it as a, yeah. Hold on. There we go. I entitled it "The Spirit of the West." And first of all, I'd like to thank Chris DeHart and Jean Nels for inviting me here. And it gives me a great opportunity to give back to the Joaquin Miller community. But I'm more excited about meeting all the people I've been emailing forever and never met. For instance, Tom Wolfe is here, who's going to speak tomorrow, and Margaret Cardell, who introduced me to Phoebe Cutler, who wrote an excellent article on the Heights. There it is, Joaquin Miller and the Social Circle at the Heights. This is online, and she said that this was the last copy that was in hard form, but you can get it online. And it really where I'm going is the Heights in Oakland. I'm probably the first one to address that area. And then, as Bill Mee said, it was 1890s till when he passed. Phoebe, I do have to say, I don't know if Margaret remembers this. I haven't met her, but she put me in touch with Phoebe, and Phoebe one day emailed me, says, "Have you heard from Margaret? What is she? Something's." And she got all worried, and so, being in the Merchant Marine and a guy of action, I found out where she lived and emailed her and tried to phone her, and so couldn't get a hold of her, and so I called the sheriffs for a wellness check, and they came back, said she was okay. But that's a warning to all you others: if I send you an email, you better respond. So who is this guy? Well, my name is Robert Boyle. I'm the family genealogist, and although I'm not very good at it, I am horrible in cemeteries, and they don't make sense. I hate birth and death dates. So now I call myself a barnyard historian. And that keeps the curators and librarians from rolling their eyes when they come in, and I get to look in the back room occasionally. The downside is that at Thanksgiving I can't bore my family, and I get muzzled to my passions. My passion is my great aunt Gertrude for Carson, I guess that's how you say, Boyle Cano. And she was a Bohemian sculpturist who ended up at Joaquin Miller's Heights from 1904 till his death. My project started in 1908 when during the summer of the fires, I lived in Paradise and we got evacuated twice. I ended up going up to Maryhill Museum on the Columbia. And there in a closet were two of her pieces. The biggest is the piece which she wanted to make a memorial in Twin Peaks, but it ended up at the Maryhill Museum that is loaded with Rodin-esque statuettes. This is, on the right, is the Spirit of the West, is her bust. And it took her 8 years to complete as she lived at the Heights. On the left is a picture taken by Louis J. Stillman, who was a very good friend of Gertrude's and ended up being her biographer. And right now I'm looking at 100 poems and all this stuff that they went through. But I wanted to show this picture because it almost mirrors exactly what the statue was trying to show. In the February 1914, when I started researching for this presentation, I went back to look at his death, and then there on the cover, Out West magazine, was Gertrude with her bust. And what I wanted to focus on the bust is that it was kind of a transition for her in her attitude. So I have a couple of phases in this presentation. The first is I'm going to talk about is the bust itself. On the right, you'll see a relief portrait, and I brought it with me, and it's under that window over there. This is how she, instead of sketching, she used to do clay on a board, and she could do it anywhere. She did many portraits during her period in those 8 years, but the bust of Miller was basically the catalyst. And I came to this realization a couple days ago was that she really didn't like doing portrait sculpture on a commercial basis. So if you were a famous person and she redefined her art during this 8 years to put conditions on what art she would do. So she would pick and choose who her subject was, and basically she kind of had to like them or respect them. She didn't do it on commission basis. She would speculate. So most of those would be in plaster, and then she would observe them. The basis of her art, or bringing out the best possible piece of a person, bringing it from what would be a death mask to a piece of good art, would be to bring their inner spirit out into the piece. And so when she talks about Spirit of the West, she is talking about the West not being the character of the West, but actually the beauty and the nature of the West of the Sierra Nevadas. And Joaquin Miller kind of codified this for her in her life. I'm going way off base here. Of Joaquin Miller, she said, this font went way down, I don't know. Have I not seen the elements personified? Fire, wind, the heat of the sun, the strength of the earth, the flowing rhythm of the river, the power of the sea. also strangely combined in this man so close to nature and to spirit. This picture here was taken in Washington, D.C. when she tried to get it, the cabin in Washington, D.C., they tried to have this mounted there. Of the spirit of the West, she said, "Those who have seen my portrayal of the poet in this phase marvel at the fire in the eye. Well, I saw the fire. They're both earth reflected and the inner fire of creation, the cosmic fire that all real poets and creative artists know." I brought this picture up basically to show you what the contrast would be as a portrait. This is Edwin Markham, her friend, but he doesn't look too happy getting his portrait done here. But this is the kind of work she detested, and to this type of art, she said, "Art should not be mere imitation, photographic portrayal. It must rather be creative portrayal of the soul of the subject, recreating the nature, the material, and interpreting the spirit of it." Towards portrait sitting, she said, "I find them irksome, distasteful, towards creating that perfect harmony necessary for her work." She said later in her career, in study of men that I choose, she chooses them for my subjects, the strong types of Western men. I always went to them in their haunts and watched them at work for a period before attempting to model them. I watched a subject until I got the keynote of his spirit. So life before the Heights, I had to go, I want to show you this because her life does reflect a lot about Joaquin Miller. She accumulated impressive credentials and did some of the greatest pioneers of the West, both alive and fallen. Her work is often referred to as Rodin-esque, and that's when you're looking at them, it's kind of the rough texture. But she varies from that. She bristled at being called the Rodin-esque, but she was also called the Rodin of the West. She refused to leave California except to go to Japan. She did go to New York, rather, I'm sorry. This is when she was at school. Just it epitomizes her kind of attitude, renouncing conventionalities. And these pictures were taken by Anne Brigman, who is just an absolute fantastic photographer. This is some more of her earlier work at school. Then she quit school in 1901, and her first piece was to do Joseph LeConte after his death. And then her plan was to, she did some medallions, and she wanted to sell those to get the piece cast. Now, I couldn't even, I have, some of my dreaded emails are all over Berkeley right now, looking for the bust. And I convinced my cousin to buy one of the medallions, and pretty pricey, but I've found it on, but she hasn't sent me a copy. Her second one was the John Muir bust in 1901, and it is in Montalvo Art Center in Saratoga. James Phelan bought 3 of her pieces, and you can see them there. The medallion on the right is the one sitting over here. Now, her access to John Muir was through John Swett, who was the educator, the founder of education in California, basically. He was the 4th superintendent. He recruited my great-grandmother to come to California in 1862, and she was actually the first teacher in the California state education system as the principal of the normal school. John Swett lived next door to John Muir, convinced him to write. And so anyway, that's how she ended up doing John Sweat's bust and John Muir's at the same time. William Keith had a studio opposite her earlier in her career, and before she went to the Heights. And this is dated 1915, but it took her a long time to get these done too. Now this is my find of the year right here. It was often said that she did Jack London's bust, but I never had any proof of it. And then one day I have this box of stuff that I've been going through for about a year, and rolled up in the bottom of an envelope was this little negative, and I flattened it out, and there it is. Probably this is the first public showing of it as far as I know. And this was done in 1902, and the bust was destroyed in an earthquake. And then I just couldn't help myself. I found this photograph in my secret box. And this is Blanche Partington, who was in the Keith studio area. And this is a Christmas card she addressed to Joaquin Miller in 1896. She was also one of Jack London's lovers. One of the first actual commercial jobs that Gertrude did was in 1903, if you recall the famous Theodore Roosevelt visit when he visits John Muir go to Yosemite. Well, before all that started, they had all this presentation and stuff going in San Francisco. Well, this was an Oakland Inner Harbor fog bell, biggest casting of 4,000 pounds. But on the little red square on the left is a portrait she did of Theodore Roosevelt. The bell is shown here in the lighthouse, and I'm still can't find that bell. I don't know, where do you put a 4,000-pound bell? She did a lot of this work up in 1902 up near Yosemite, and her brother was a lawyer and really was destined to go places, but he died at 31 of nervous prostration. So if you see me laying down, call 911. It's in the family. But anyway, this created one of the first a lot of grief in the family. And so then the same year, her grandmother, who was she was a pioneer educator ignored by history. Her history is just unbelievable and is almost as amazing. And I actually researched the fact that she is a third cousin to Ena Coolidge's mother. So they were related, but I don't think they realized it. I could go on for an hour on her, but so Gertrude took off. She went down to Arizona and went down to the Grand Canyon with a lot of artists, and she actually had a copper mine down there, copper and asbestos. And then she went and traveled with the Navajo and the Hopi and was one of the first women to be seen, white women to be seen by the natives down there, or the Indians. And these are pictures she took while she was down there. So she finally returned back, and she decided to abandon sculpturing, and she wanted to start writing. And mostly because of physical demand of the art. And that's why I bring this one up. This is taken later, but to give you a sense of how hard that was, is look at the size of these things. And it's not so much to make the sculpture, it's to have an exhibition. It's hauling this stuff I gotta haul this stuff here, or I gotta haul this stuff here. And that's before, trucks and cranes and everything else, and the family had a tendency to live on hills. I do, you know, like uphill. But when she made this move, Joaquin Miller, this is included in her first copy, it congratulates her on the decision, encourages her. So they launched the magazine. It was called Ability, and it was to explore the genius in us all. And the first subscribers just are this testament of who she was appreciated by: William Keith, John Muir, Jack London, James Phelan, who was arch enemy of John Muir and Hetch Hetchy, George Sterling, Arnold Jenneth, and Adelaide Hanscom. Oh, I want to go back. That's my favorite. So what happened was that Joaquin Miller summoned Gertrude to come to the Heights to do a bust of his mother. And this was a commission job because it was, in my opinion, because it very quickly got cast and eventually went up to the University of Oregon. But I got this picture and I went, whoa. In fact, I had this up at Thanksgiving one time when we were competing for television time, and my wife's cousin's boyfriend wanted to put, you know, his fishing trip up or something, and so I snuck this up, and then the whole family comes in, and we hear all this dog barking, and it's the little foo-foo dog. Coco is like, does not like Margaret here. So the great, when Gertrude ends up at the Heights, and basically little did anybody know that at the time that they would be a lifelong friendship and respect and communion would happen. And it's not bound by age or the typical mentor protege relationships, but it was fed more from the free spirit, the nonconformity, the exploration of imagination. And also she fell in love, and that'll do it every time. She fell in love with Isen Takashi Kano, who was a poet, philosopher, and he was a protege of Joaquin Miller. I don't think this picture's ever been seen either. So the two of them became an integral part of the art community. So she finally came. She came to rest and found solace, and she a like-kind camaraderie, and the intellects of the day would come there. It was the epicenter of the Bohemian era, and so she just fell in love with the place. And so now I'm going to go through some of the things that happened. The Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam was a book that Adelaide Hanscom took the pictures of. And this is Gertrude on the left and Joaquin Miller on the right. The Bohemians love this modeling for this thing. One of the other ones was Luther Burbank, the horticulturist from Santa Rosa, where I grew up. And here's another one of a great genius who didn't Blanche Cummings had to convince him to take the picture on the right. So then that was a little end to finally get him to do his bust. And that was, and here you see that he moved away from the Rodin-esque texture. He went very smooth. The Mark Twain bust, this is after he passed away, but it was based on, we have a family history story that my great-great-grandfather boxed Mark Twain at the Olympic Club in 1860s, and so that was always stuck in our family's brain, and so when he died, she did this bust. This bust disappeared, was sitting on a foundry shelf till 1965. The Abdul Baha'i visited Oakland. Kano was the translator. And after that, they always had a good relationship with the Baha'i, but they never, Gertrude was not a joiner. She, on her library biography card, it says, you know, what organizations do you belong to, and it's written in her hand, none whatsoever. So one of the biggest things that Kano did was this esoteric play called Creation Dawn. You can see it by the pictures. It's pretty wild. This is in Carmel at the Forest Theater in the summer of 1913. But the interesting thing was this is the first performance by the composer Henry Cowell, and Kano kind of had a different ego. He thought all the clapping was for him, but really it was for Henry. And this is the bust she did later in life for him. In the picture at the top is him when he was young, and that was taken by Adam Ansel. Gertrude loved to pair, this is the bust she did of Kano and then Joaquin, and she liked to pair the two together and call it the Occidental and Oriental. Aldrich Thompson bust was, he was an educator from the Kamehameha School, and when Hawaii turned over, and he was basically comes into play later with Margaret Sanger and eugenics and that kind of thing. But his daughter was a lifelong friend with Gertrude, and they and helped in their biography material that I hold. This is probably one of the, I have a huge 80-page paper she wrote on this called Following the Comet. And this is done in 1931, where she stalked Einstein across from New York to Pasadena, and they wouldn't let her near him. And so she camped out right next door, rented a house, and so she was doing some of these relief portraitures as her sketch, and had never even sat with him in the modeling to the last day, where you see this famous picture on the right where he's sitting in the garden in Pasadena, where she got to finally measure his head a couple times. And this bust took me 4 years to find, and I finally found it in a dilapidated Buddhist temple in San Francisco that the bust was sitting in the attic until 1949 because the occupants were interred. This is her probably most famous bust is of Christy Mathewson, and well, I like this one is because she has a lot of Greek or mythology in her background because of her mother was such a great educator, and so she puts kind of a little Greek spin into this one. And so this one's at the Hall of Fame, and which on the right I took that about a year ago. Okay, so that was that, and now is my political thing. I went to Washington, D.C. this last spring, and I did go see the Joaquin Miller cabin. There's not one sign for it. It looks like a gardener's shed. I mean, it's really in bad shape. I found the pamphlet on the left to show you the comparison. And so I think this community here, if you know who to write, if they're even accepting letters today, there's a cause. Because this could be our next Capitol building, the way things are going. So I'd like thank you for inviting me here, and And then if you have any questions, I'll be around and try to answer anything I can.